The battlefield lay in smoldering ruins, a graveyard of broken bodies and shattered metal. Smoke curled into the sky, painting the air with the acrid scent of charred flesh and burnt circuitry. Among the wreckage, one figure remained, motionless, his iridescent blue skin marred by deep wounds. His four arms, once powerful and deadly in battle, now lay limp at his sides. His legs, shattered beyond repair, rendered him immobile. He was a warrior of the Zalari, an elite soldier of a species feared across the galaxy. And yet, as he lay there dying, not a single one of his kind came to save him. Sergeant Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the ruins, his pulse still hammering from the adrenaline of combat. The battle had been brutal. The Zalari, though fearsome, had underestimated humanity's resilience. The United Earth forces had pushed back, leaving the battlefield littered with the dead and dying of both species. Daniel's gaze swept across the devastation until it landed on the paralyzed Zalari warrior. The alien's four eyes flickered open, locking onto Daniel's with a mixture of pain and silent defiance. Zalari were proud creatures, bred for war, conditioned never to show weakness. And yet, this one had been left behind, abandoned by his own people. The United Earth forces were pulling back, securing their wounded and leaving the enemy casualties to their fate. Daniel knew he should turn away, should follow orders like the rest of his squad. But something held him in place. The Zalari warrior's breath was ragged, his body struggling to hold on to life. In that moment, he was no longer an enemy. He was a soldier, just like Daniel, a warrior left to die alone. Daniel clenched his fists. He had lost too many comrades in this war. He had seen men and women he called brothers and sisters perish in agony, and the thought of leaving someone, anyone, behind to suffer that fate made his stomach turn. Against every protocol, against every instinct drilled into him, Daniel stepped forward. The Zalari's eyes widened slightly as the human soldier knelt beside him. He didn't speak, merely watching with silent wariness as Daniel reached into his medical kit. The alien's physiology was vastly different from that of a human, but wounds were wounds. Pain was pain. And survival? Survival was universal. Daniel worked quickly, sealing the worst of the wounds with biofoam, trying to stabilize the warrior enough to move him. He could feel eyes on him, his squadmates watching in confusion, their radios crackling with calls for him to fall back. But Daniel ignored them. He wasn't going to leave this warrior to die. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, reached down, and lifted the paralyzed Zalari onto his back. The alien was heavier than he looked, his dense musculature making the journey arduous. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, against the whispers in his mind telling him he was a fool. But Daniel had made his choice. He carried the warrior through the smoking remains of the battlefield, ignoring the incredulous stares of his fellow soldiers. When he finally reached the extraction point, he was met with rifles pointed at him, his commanding officer's expression twisted in a mix of fury and disbelief. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Sergeant?" Captain Reynolds barked. "That's an enemy combatant." "He's dying," Daniel said simply, shifting the weight of the Zalari on his back. "And I'm not leaving him here." Reynolds exhaled sharply, glancing at the alien with barely disguised contempt. "We don't have the resources to waste on an enemy. Drop him and get on the transport." Daniel met his captain's gaze, unflinching. "Then court-martial me." "But I'm not letting him die." A tense silence stretched between them before Reynolds finally let out a curse. "Damn it, Hayes." "Fine. But he's your responsibility." Relief flooded Daniel, but he didn't let it show. He carried the Zalari onto the transport, ignoring the muttered curses and wary glances from his fellow soldiers. As the ship lifted off, he looked down at the wounded warrior. The alien's eyes met his, filled with something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps just confusion. Either way, Daniel knew he had made the right choice. Because war might make monsters out of men, but he refused to let it make one out of him. And so, he had saved the paralyzed alien warrior. But what neither of them knew was that this single act of defiance would change the course of the war, and the fate of their species, forever. The journey back to the base was filled with an uneasy silence. Soldiers whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Daniel and the Zalari. The tension was thick, but Daniel ignored it, keeping his focus on the alien. The warrior's breathing had steadied slightly, but he remained weak, his body struggling against the trauma it had endured. Upon arrival, Daniel was immediately pulled aside by military medics and higher-ranking officers. The Zalari was taken to the infirmary under heavy guard, while Daniel was escorted to a debriefing room. Hours passed as he faced interrogation after interrogation. Why had he done it? What did he expect to gain? Did he understand the potential consequences of his actions? Daniel answered each question with the same resolve. Because he was a soldier left behind. Because I couldn't let him die. Because I'm human. The brass wasn't satisfied, but they also weren't ready to throw him in the brig, not yet. The political implications of his actions were too volatile. Word had already begun to spread. Some saw him as a fool, others as a hero. The Zalari's fate was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Daniel had set something into motion that could not be undone. Meanwhile, in the infirmary, the Zalari warrior, whose name, Daniel would later learn, was Varesh, struggled to make sense of what had happened. His own people had abandoned him, yet his enemy had saved his life. Weak as he was, he watched the human doctors work on him, their expressions wary but professional, and in his heart, a seed of something unfamiliar began to take root. Perhaps not all humans were as he had been taught. Perhaps this one, at least, was different. And perhaps, just perhaps, this one act of mercy could change everything. Days passed, and Varesh's condition improved. Despite the tension within the base, Daniel frequently visited him, bringing updates and attempting conversation. Though wary at first, Varesh began responding, his voice weak but steady. They spoke of war, of duty, of honor, and slowly, trust formed between them. But the outside world was changing. News of Daniel's actions had reached both human and Zalari leaders. There were those who saw it as an opportunity for peace, and those who saw it as treason. Soon, the fate of not just Daniel and Varesh, but their entire species, would rest on the choices they made next. War councils convened, diplomats scrambled, and the fragile tension between their peoples teetered on the brink of collapse. But amidst it all, a human soldier and a paralyzed Zalari warrior stood at the center of it, a symbol of something greater than war. As they faced what was to come, Varesh looked at Daniel and said, "Perhaps enemies are simply allies who have not yet understood one another." Daniel nodded. "Then let's make them understand. Together." And with that, a new chapter in history began. One not written in blood, but in the courage of those who dared to defy the tide of war.